Welcome back to the last video of Module 2 in the Epigenetics section. As promised, today we will review the assumptions that underlie instrumental variable analyses and consider how those would play out in analyses that involve epigenetic markers. These assumptions apply to any method that we previously discussed, whether it's garden variety Mendelian randomization or bidirectional Mendelian randomization, or the two-step approach that was specifically devised for epigenetic scenarios. As long as you're using an instrumental variable, you will need to make sure it meets these assumptions. So we will start with a refresher of these assumptions, and I do not at all feel bad for including what you've already covered previously, probably many times, because these assumptions are that important. Without them, you would not have valid estimates of causal effects. As we go through them, think, which ones would be the hardest to satisfy when you're working with epigenetic data? And is it really any different from other types of Mendelian randomization analyses? The answer to that question would really vary depending on the specific study. We will illustrate how you may test these assumptions in practice by using a published example of an especially thorough bidirectional Mendelian randomization study of circulating lipids, those are things like triglycerides, cholesterol, and so on, and DNA methylation. That paper is linked on the slide, and unless otherwise specified, the figures used in this video come from that publication. So let me illustrate three key assumptions using an example of body mass index and heart disease. It's not an epigenetics example, but we'll get there too. In this case, the exposure, which is the body mass index, has very well-known epigenetic determinants, for example, SNPs in the FTO gene. The first assumption is really the simplest. Your instrumental variable, that FTO SNP, has to cause the exposure. In this case, let's say it's higher BMI. How do we test that? By looking at the association between the FTO SNP and the phenotype of BMI. You can even use prior published estimates of FTO SNP effects on BMI as evidence of effect that would satisfy assumption number 1. Assumption 2 states that your instrumental variable must not be associated with potential confounders of the association between exposure and disease. That applies to both measured and unmeasured confounders, so by definition, it can be challenging to verify, to say the least. One could say it's impossible to empirically verify. In this example, we need to assume that FTO genotype has no associations with any third factor that can cause both higher BMI and higher risk of heart disease. Hopefully, because genotype is indeed randomly distributed at conception, it will not have a relationship to any of those confounders because on average they would be evenly distributed across those who have the risk allele and those who do not. That's a consequence of that random assignment. Finally, the third assumption precludes any pleiotropic effects. That means FTO genotype cannot cause heart disease through any mechanism other than its effect on BMI. That assumption is also impossible to verify empirically because we cannot test every possible physiologic pathway that could ostensibly link FTO genotype and heart disease. And that's okay because you've already learned from Stephen's section that there are methods such as Egger regression that allow you to relax this assumption. The problem is that these methods come with their own set of issues, and one of them is pretty critical. It's potentially insufficient statistical power. With all these assumptions, the key message is that we need to rely on subject matter knowledge to make an intelligent assessment of their feasibility, particularly when we cannot empirically test them. And that is particularly important for things like pleiotropy, which is pretty hard to verify statistically for reasons that I described before, all those issues with Egger and other methods. Now let's revisit these same three assumptions, except now imagine that instead of body mass index, our exposure of interest is the methylation of the FTO gene. Maybe we have biological reasons to believe that epigenetic changes in that region may causally impact a serious outcome like heart disease. So the question is, would the assumptions change just because we're using an epigenetic exposure? Not really. Actually, not one bit. We still have to ensure that number one, our genetic instrument is strongly associated with the methylation marker. Our instrument in this case would be an MEQTL SNP in the FTO gene, hopefully something near our CPG of interest, but not in the probe itself, or it could be multiple such SNPs, and we can test that association easily using regression-based methods. The nice thing here is, remember I said you do not have to do it all in the same data set. Let's say, for example, that you have genotype but not methylation data, which happens a lot because methylation is pretty expensive to measure. But you've been thinking about epigenetics and you have a hypothesis. And you want to test the causal effect of methylation on your outcome, but you don't have methylation. So what you do is you obtain a genetic proxy for methylation from another data set that has both. In the next module, I will introduce some resources that could allow you to do just that. And that would let you test assumption 1. Assumption 2, again, since your instrumental variable is still genetic and randomly assigned at conception, that genotype is, you hope that randomization worked, and your confounders, whether measured or not, are on average similar across genotype groups, so there's no association. The third one is the assumption of no pleiotropy, and that's where things get especially tricky for epigenetics. Not only is it hard to definitively rule out pleiotropy, empirically speaking, it is hard for us to apply that prior subject knowledge because we know so little about epigenetics. We don't know if our MEQTL has any pleiotropic effects because we're only starting to crack the surface of what effects MEQTL have in general. Because of that, we have to rely on statistical measures like agar, but we cannot completely ignore this potentially serious threat of pleiotropy. So all three assumptions are important, but my personal opinion is that in the epigenetic setting, the third one is probably the one that worries me the most. So here's a recap. To make sure your instrumental variable can produce valid estimates of effect, here's what you can do. First, you make sure it is robustly associated with the methylation of the CPG site that you're interested in, and you make sure that association is real and not just an artifact, which is what can happen if your SNP is directly on the methylation probe. You hope and you cross your fingers that Mother Nature's randomization worked, and you do not have to worry about confounders. If you're nervous, you can check to see if people with different genotypes also differ in their confounder distribution. You can do that for measured confounders, but of course you cannot do that for unmeasured ones. So again, you have to rely on randomization working. Finally, and this is the one I've highlighted before, please do your due diligence as far as testing for pleiotropy, because at this point we do not know what other effects your MEQTL can have. And if we do not properly account for that, our estimates would be biased. We don't want that. Now let's go through an example of how these assumptions, to the best of our ability, can be tested in practice. This is from a paper by Deckers and others on the relationship between epigenetic variation, specifically methylation in blood, DNA methylation in blood, and plasma lipids. Again, things like triglycerides and various kinds of cholesterol. This study was done in a meta cohort of several European cohorts to the total of about 3,000 participants. The first thing the investigators did, as shown here in the diagram, is simply establish observational associations between DNA methylation and lipids. Out of 450,000 CPG sites that they tested, 28 were found to be associated with one lipid or another. But we know by now that association does not mean causation, partly because this association can be all sorts of confounded, which takes us to step B. In step B, they took those 28 CPGs that were identified in the observational epigenetic study and asked the following question. Is there a causal effect of lipids on methylation at these loci? Note that often we think of the other direction first, thinking of methylation as an exposure rather than the outcome. But in this case, biological knowledge suggested looking at it this way because lipids often control their own synthesis, and possibly that happens through epigenetic mechanisms. So they found a polygenic risk score consisting of multiple SNPs that were reliably established to be associated with lipids, and they tested for association between that instrumental variable, which here is denoted as P, and the methylation outcome, M. Out of 28 statistically significant observational associations, 13 showed evidence of causal effect in that direction. So we now have 13 CpGs that seem to be causally modified by plasma lipids. And remember, we started with 28, but we're not going to worry about the ones without causal evidence for now. So 13 it is. For those, we make sure that these observed causal effects only occur through lipids, and that is done through essentially regression models that aimed to rule out a direct effect of the instrumental variable on the outcome. If you're interested in the details of how that was done, please check out the paper linked on slide 2. Out of the 13 CpGs that we're working with at this point, only 2 did not pass this test. So now we have 11 CpGs that are potentially involved in this causal relationship. For those 11 CpGs, the investigators now tested their reverse causality using a different set of instrumental variables that were MEQTL capturing variation in methylation, and that's S. Methylation at those 11 loci is now the exposure, and lipids are the outcome, so this is a bidirectional Mendelian randomization. I forgot to mention earlier that the asterisk in all these diagrams just means that this is the genetically predicted value of, in this case, methylation, and on other slides, lipids. And hooray, after doing this analysis, which is the same old Mendelian randomization but in the opposite direction, we do not have evidence of reverse causation. So we carry forward our same 11 SNPs, or rather 11 CpGs, to the last step. And the last step is where we evaluate pleiotropy using both a multivariate model that simply includes potential effects on other measured lipids, which is what's shown here in this diagram, as well as Agar regression. 4 out of 11 epigenetic markers did not show pleiotropy using either method. 3 did using both methods, and the rest showed pleiotropy either in the Agar model or in the multivariate model. So we know 4 of them are really quite reliable. So we have the systematic approach of evaluating both directionality and causality of these observational relationships between DNA methylation and circulating plasma lipids. The paper has this very nice table 5, where you can see that for 28 CpGs initially identified in the observational study, some, like this one in the last row, truly showed potential to be modified by exposure to circulating lipids. So lipids are causing epigenetic changes. The rest were not so lucky, and perhaps they should go further down on our priority list when we're evaluating potential epigenetic targets for drug development or follow-up studies. I strongly encourage you to check out this paper as a very solid, albeit imperfect, example of how epigenetic Mendelian randomization can be thoughtfully and methodically done. And if you want to talk about why I think it's still imperfect, come to our virtual discussion on Thursday or send me an email. So what did we learn today? Epigenetic Mendelian randomization studies are actually not that different from other instrumental variable studies when it comes to assumptions and validity. You should definitely pay attention to these assumptions just as much, and in case of pleiotropy, I urge you to be even more careful, at least until we reach a deeper understanding of what each MEQTL does. This concludes the second module. Thanks for listening. And in the final module of this section, we will look at some more practical examples of how all this theory plays out in actual studies.